As the August sun set over the fields of Cannae and tens of thousands of Roman corpses, Hannibal Barca could be forgiven for believing that he had won the war against Carthage's mortal enemy. For this battle was not just his third consecutive success against Roman armies on Italian soil, but his victory at Cannae was a masterclass of tactical generalship that brilliantly turned the greatest strengths of the Roman legions against them, enticing the fearless Romans to march directly into a trap where they were encircled by a smaller force and utterly crushed. The way to Rome itself seemed open, and after years of war, the Carthaginians were overjoyed at the prospect of humbling the Romans and forcing them into a settlement as humiliating as the one inflicted on Carthage after the end of the First Punic War. Hannibal's officers all surrounded him and congratulated him on his victory, and urged that after such a magnificent success he should allow himself and his exhausted men to rest for the remainder of the day and the following night. Marhabal, however, the commandant of the cavalry, thought that they ought not to lose a moment. "That you may know," he said to Hannibal, "what has been gained by this battle, I prophesy that in 5 days you will be feasting as victor in the capital. Follow me. I will go in advance with the cavalry. They will know that you are come before they know that you are coming." But Hannibal fatefully chose not to march on Rome in the wake of his victory, a decision that centuries later Livy would claim saved the city from certain destruction. Even today, historians and armchair generals debate whether or not Hannibal made the right choice. For, though it seems obvious to us that Rome was his for the taking, the reality is not so simple, and this great military mind certainly had his reasons for remaining in southern Italy that we second-guess at our own peril. But what was he actually trying to achieve, and why, to the bewilderment of his men, did Hannibal not press his victory at the moment when Roman fortunes were at their nadir? The first, and most obvious reason why Hannibal chose not to assault Rome directly is that he lacked the siege equipment, manpower, and supplies to capture a city as well defended as Rome. For despite the ruin he had brought to the legions since entering Italy, Rome still had ample troops and citizens capable of manning its impressive walls against a direct assault. In addition, Rome's vast stores meant that a lengthy siege would be required to bring the city to its knees. This would necessitate Hannibal leaving his army in place, where he could be vulnerable to Roman relief forces. That may not seem a significant issue at first glance, because Hannibal had been victorious in 3 large encounters already. But as impressive as these triumphs were, they owed more to Hannibal's unparalleled ability to use deception and a keen psychological understanding of his opponents to dictate the locations and terms of his battles with the Romans than they did troop deployments and maneuvers on the day of battle. Were the Romans to force a confrontation outside the city, Hannibal would have to engage on Rome's terms, and could not be confident of victory. But the main reason he opted not to move towards the city is that his strategy had always been more about isolating Rome within Italy by peeling off its allies than simply defeating it outright through military means. His father Hamilcar's experience in the First Punic War likely convinced him that Rome could face innumerable setbacks, but would never surrender to a foreign foe. Rome would never kneel, at least not of its own volition. It had to be dismantled piece by piece. The grim resolve of the Romans and refusal to end a conflict on anything less than the unconditional surrender of their enemy was well known by this point. Not only had Hamilcar seen it firsthand and passed it to his son, but the legendary stories of Pyrrhus's annihilation of multiple legions achieving no real effect on Roman morale demonstrated that this refusal to cede ground had deep roots in the Roman psyche. For a Carthaginian like Hannibal, this seemed preposterous, just as it did to the Hellenic army of Epirus. In Greek and Punic society, wars were resolved quickly, typically with the victor of a lone-pitched battle dictating terms of surrender, which were readily accepted by the defeated party. The Romans conceived of warfare as total and all-encompassing in its scope. They played for keeps. There were to be no half measures in victory or defeat. This difference in philosophy likely had its roots in the fact that Carthage used its mercenary-based military to ensure that trade lanes stayed open and that its merchants received favorable terms. Conversely, Romans saw no point in leaving an opponent in a position where they could potentially threaten Rome ever again. War was used to seize and hold territory, and force the conquered into slavery, servitude, and perpetual subjugation. The elite in Rome thus felt that victory was their divine right, and that surrendering to a foreign foe, even on good terms that preserved independence, was tantamount to becoming slaves themselves. The Roman had a high conception of his libertas, and to accept defeat was to cease to be Roman. Surrender, therefore, was utterly inconceivable. Hannibal was remarkably well attuned to how the Romans thought, but even he seems to have been unable to grasp just how fundamental this concept was to the Roman psyche. From consuls down to the lowest legionary, death was preferable to any encroachment on his absolute liberty as a citizen. From the moment he entered the peninsula, Hannibal knew that he would be outnumbered, so his only hope was to level the playing field by convincing Rome's Italian allies to rally to his side. He had quickly secured the loyalty of tribes in Cisalpine Gaul by playing on their animosity towards Rome, and he felt that when push came to shove, the allied communities would revolt against their Roman overlords. He sought to encourage defections by releasing all prisoners taken from allied communities, and promising that Carthage would be a more lenient hegemon than the Romans. Aware of how important liberty was to the Italian, he presented himself as their liberator from the oppressive Romans. On paper, it seems like a sound strategy. Rome's Italian allies had long chafed under a system that forced them to provide troops for Rome's wars without a say in the conflicts themselves or an equal share in the profits and plunder that they brought in. For each allied community had differing status depending on the terms of its absorption into the Roman alliance system. But even those with the most privileges had at best only limited political rights and meager protection from arbitrary punishment by capricious Roman magistrates. Italy was also far from being united by a common Roman culture at this point, with many of these communities still speaking their own languages and observing their own unique religious practices. These soldiers from allied communities that lacked Roman citizenship made up roughly half of the armed forces that Rome could muster, and to Hannibal it seemed perfectly rational to assume that they would abandon Rome if he appeared to be a better bet. But Hannibal would find the diplomatic aspect of his conflict with Rome exponentially more frustrating than the military dimension. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. For despite his battlefield success and the inability of Rome to dislodge him from southern Italy, he remained largely unable to entice allied communities to abandon Rome from outside his area of direct influence. His chief prizes were Capua, which had joined him willingly, and the city of Tarentum, which had been seized through some trademark Punic trickery. In addition, he secured the allegiance of two prominent Samnite tribes, perhaps not particularly shocking, as the fiercely independent hill tribes of Samnium had been Rome's most implacable foes during the early Republic, and still resented Rome's position as the overlords of Italy. However, Hannibal was never able to win over the allies of central Italy, much less those in the north. This likely vexed him, for he had grown up with an intense hatred of Rome, and was probably conditioned to believe that others who had been wronged by the Republic shared his antipathy. Furthermore, Carthage itself had an incredibly strained relationship with its allies in North Africa, and he most likely felt that Roman allies were as desperate to escape the boot on their necks as Carthage's had proven to be. But as he learned over the next decade of his campaign in Italy, this was not the case. Rome's allies had their gripes with the political arrangement that determined how and where their citizens would serve as soldiers, but overall, they were largely content to continue under Roman domination. Rome had secured these surprisingly strong bonds of loyalty by repeatedly demonstrating to its allies that there were rewards for good behavior and brutal reprisals in store for those who transgressed. The centrality of patronage to Roman social dynamics extends beyond the political sphere to encompass every aspect of life. Elites from allied communities may not have had formal political rights, but they had the ears of the powerful in Rome, and by all accounts, the tight relationships formed through the patron-client system were beneficial to both parties. The allied nobility were tied through military service, marriage, and business to senatorial clans. The implications were clear. Continued loyalty was the path to Roman blessings and greater prosperity, while stepping out of line would result in serious repercussions. And Rome had ample opportunity to demonstrate that it would deal harshly with any allied communities that joined Hannibal, for the Carthaginian was soon to discover that securing the loyalty of small towns and cities was a double-edged sword, for he had gained just enough to tie him to the defense of these communities, but not enough to give him the manpower he needed to chip away at the superior and constantly replenished Roman army. Hannibal would discover, in the decade after Cannae, that he could not be everywhere at once. Roman legions would shadow him, but eschewed set-piece battles. Instead, they harassed his scouts and foragers while remaining in defensible positions that Hannibal dared not challenge directly. With Hannibal locked in this deadly dance, other Roman forces would pass through southern Italy unimpeded, brutally punishing any areas that had switched their allegiance to Carthage. These movements were expertly coordinated, striking with lightning speed during harvest season, and ensuring that assaults and sieges occurred simultaneously at great distances, so that Hannibal could never respond to all threats at once. Hannibal was in an impossible bind, and faced death by 1,000 cuts. But though he never achieved another victory on the scale of Cannae, he still enjoyed remarkable success against the Romans, defeating them in 4 pitched battles between 212 and 209. Roman commanders were learning how to deal with Hannibal, but this game of cat and mouse was counter to their entire philosophy of war, and every Roman aristocrat had the ambition, eagerness, and confidence required to delude himself into thinking he would be the one to bring back Hannibal's head on a pike. This never quite worked out for them, and tens of thousands of legionaries would pay for this arrogance with their lives. But for all his victories in the field, Hannibal was never able to win the war of attrition with the Romans. When Capua fell in 211, Rome was resolved to make an example of what had been the most prominent city to defect. Thus, about 70 prominent senators were put to death, some 300 noble Campanians were put in prison, and others, who were distributed among citizens of Latin allies to be guarded, met death in different ways. The remaining mass of Campanian citizens were sold. In regard to the city and its territory, discussion continued, inasmuch as some thought a city very powerful, near, and unfriendly should be destroyed. But immediate advantage prevailed, for on account of the territory, which was well known to be foremost in Italy in all that the fertile soil produced, the city was preserved, that the tillers of the land might have some abode. To people the city, the multitude of resident aliens and freedmen and petty tradesmen and artisans were retained. The whole territory and the buildings became public property of the Roman people. But it was decided that Capua, as a nominal city, should merely be a dwelling place and a center of population, but should have no political body, nor senate, nor council of the plebs, nor magistrates. After the devastation of Capua, there would be no more turncoats. Despite the presence of his undefeated veteran army in southern Italy, the people of the region feared the Romans more than Hannibal. Without reinforcement from Carthage, his days were numbered. In frustration, he returned to Carthage in 203, answering the summons of his home city to protect her from the only threat that Hannibal could never have foreseen, Publius Cornelius Scipio, a Roman general who was every bit his equal. Their confrontation at Zama would decide the war, and it would be the only time that Hannibal lost a battle. He knew nothing but success in Spain, Gaul, and Italy, but tasted defeat in his homeland. As he retreated from Zama, he knew that the war he had devoted nearly 2 decades to fighting was lost. For Hannibal had been defeated by his greatest student. Scipio had embraced Hannibal's knack for deception and trickery to fight battles on his own terms. When combined with Rome's superior manpower reserves and unflinching resolve, this development spelled the end of Carthage's ability to wage war. But by forcing the Romans to adapt to his new mode of warfare, Hannibal had exposed the fatal contradictions at the heart of the Republic, as it outgrew the constitutional framework of a city-state and stretched across the wider Mediterranean as a new superpower. New precedents set to empower Scipio, such as elevating him to his initial command despite not meeting legal requirements, and the general rewarding his long-serving troops with land grants, would prove to be recurring issues over the next century and a half as the Republic eroded under the weight of its own military might and imperial ambitions. Hannibal was unable to keep his famous oath to destroy the Roman Republic, but the chaos, fear, and dissension he sowed among its elite leadership did at least get the ball rolling.